I can hear something calling. It's calling me every day. If taking a chance is a crime, then I've got hell to pay. I've been walking the streets in my mind, trying to find a new day. Keep on searching until I will find, until I find a new way. I'm gonna say something, I hope you don't mind. It's time to rearrange. I walk round in circles, I'm going nowhere. It's time to make a change.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. I'm your host, Charles Wallace. As many of you know, I am a huge music fan. And with that, I'm a huge Beatles fan. So today's interview, selfishly, is as much for me as it is for anybody. I enjoy having this man on. He's doing some phenomenal work, has written amazing books, and to me, one of the most knowledgeable Beatles historians that are out there. So please, without further ado, let's jump into my interview with David Bedford. David, how you doing? Thanks for joining me today. I appreciate it.
It's a pleasure to be back with you. Looking forward to it.
So, again, we just said before we started, I'm thrilled to have you back on. You were one of my earlier episodes, like almost 2 years ago. Time does fly. I'm happy though that even though you're on here once, you still decided to come back on. So thanks for that.
Pleasure.
So, if you wouldn't mind, for those who may not have seen the first episode, could you give just a brief introduction of yourself?
So I live in Liverpool, just off Penny Lane. I grew up in the Dingle, right by the bottom of the street where Ringo was born. I went to the primary school that Ringo went to, St. Silas, but very, very many years later, I would point out, I'm not as old as him.
Mm-hmm.
I've lived by Penny Lane last 35 years with my wife, got 3 daughters, all born in the same hospital as John Lennon, all attended the same school that John and George went to, Dovedown School, where I'm chair of governors. And I'm trying to think time back 2000, so nearly 24 years ago, Yoko Ono gave us Dovedown School a sizable donation. And I thought, this is great. People have this negative view of Yoko. And I thought, that'll be fun. I should actually write the story. So I wrote the story for the London Beatles fan club. And then I just started writing more. It's the first time I'd done anything like that. And it was just good fun. And then me being me, I get a little bit obsessive. And I decided I'll read a book about the Beatles in Liverpool. And there wasn't one. So it took me 9 years, but I wrote it. And that's the first one you can see behind me, Liverpool, birthplace of the Beatles. And for me, that was just the fun of doing it. Suddenly, I was in demand and I started making trips to America, into Europe, and I couldn't stop writing then. So I'm up to about 8 books now, I think. And I just love what I get to do.
Well, that shows. I know from the first time we met, and I've followed you ever since. I absolutely can tell you enjoy what you were doing. And, myself personally being a Beatles fan, I enjoy your content and what you're doing.
Thank you.
You start off there, you mentioned the books. So I think this is a great place to start. I want to talk a little bit about the Beatles' creative journey. And could you maybe talk a little bit about some of the lesser known influences on the Beatles music that, they really shaped their sound, but haven't been too widely acknowledged?
Well, yeah, the most recent book, on the other side of my shoulder, The Country of Liverpool. I was asked to write the biography of a lovely guy called Phil Brady, who was in a group called Phil Brady and the Ranchers in the 60s. And what I knew and was always known in Liverpool was Liverpool was known as the Nashville of the North, because you had the biggest country western scene, definitely in the UK, probably in Europe. You know, country music was huge here. And he just turned up with a suitcase full of all the flyers, newspaper cuttings, you name it, of his career. So I said, yeah, no, it'll be a pleasure. I'll do the biography. And I was curious. And I started digging, as I do, and realizing the story he was telling, country music was happening at the same time as the Beatles, but there was such an overlap that I think, hang on, there's more to this. So I've been good friends with the guys from the Quarrymen for getting on for 20 years. And since we last spoke, I've now joined the Quarrymen. So it's mad how these things happen. So having known them for so many years, and they asked me to step in, and now I'm playing with John Lennon's original Quarrymen group, which is phenomenal. So talking particularly with Rod Davis and Colin Hanson, Rod is a real music historian. And so I was going back, having started on Phil's story, thinking, well, it all goes back to skiffle. And then I found this business card that Nigel Wally had made for the Quarrymen. And along the top, it says the musical styles: country, western, skiffle, rock and roll. So I start then talking in more depth with Rod about the music, and you realise that the skiffle that started everything through Lonnie Donegan had its roots in American country music and American folk music. So then you start researching American country music, and you go back, down to the beginning of the 20th century, really, of that roots country that was coming from the Appalachian Mountains. And you think, okay, so where does the music from the Appalachian Mountains come from? That comes from Britain. So it was, you go back another stage, and you've got British folk music, a lot of English folk music, but particularly the Ulster Scots, who had settled in northern, what we now know as Northern Ireland, and they bring the Scottish folk music and the Irish together. There was a mass migration from there across to America. That's where that folk music then goes to the Appalachian Mountains, which comes down as the roots of country music. Then the country music then gets shipped over to here with the people we called the Cunard Yanks. So these are the Liverpool sailors who were crossing the Atlantic, going shopping in New York, buying records and bringing them back here and handing them out. So Liverpool had country music, jazz, blues, rhythm and blues, you name it. It was all coming into Liverpool ahead of any other place in Britain. So country music became huge here. So I think, okay, so the roots of skiffle are in country. And then I was talking to a guy called Michael Hill. Mike went to Dovedale and Quarry Bank with John Lennon. Mike introduced John to the music of Little Richard. And here's one of those things as an irony, right? I turn my phone off, but it's ringing now. And it's Colin Hanson from the Quarrymen who's ringing me. Mad. So I was talking to Mike, and he was saying, he played Long Tall Sally to John, and John said, that record was so great. When I first heard it, I couldn't speak. That's the music that took me from Liverpool to the rest of the world. But what Mike also told me was that because he was the one who bought all the records, John never bought records, apart from Rock Island Line by Lonnie Donegan. He always let somebody else buy them, then he'd borrow them. Clever lad. Yeah. And what Mike was saying, he had a number of Hank Williams records. And John was a huge Hank Williams fan. And then he started talking to lots of the other musicians of that era around Liverpool. It's the same story. Hank Williams was their first hero. So if you start listening then to Hank Williams, you hear the beginning of rock and roll. And I remember somebody said, listen to Move It On Over by Hank Williams. So listen to that. The melody of Move It On Over is Rock Around the Clock. So now you're starting to see where everything's in the country music to start with. And of course, country covers so many different genres anyway. But you start with Hank Williams, and then you took Lonnie Donegan, who's inspired by Hank Williams and Woody Guthrie, people like that, that start skiffle. And then you think, okay, who were the artists who were inspired, who the Beatles inspired? Who did they love listening to? Well, you got Elvis, who started in country. Buddy Holly, who started in country, went to rock and roll. Roy Orbison, they loved. Everly Brothers. You start listing all of these, they've all got their roots in country music. And I suddenly realized that I'd started on this journey writing Phil Brady's biography, but realized that the country music element was so important in the story of the Beatles, in the Quarrymen. So this is where, Rod Davis in particular was really helpful in just explaining where skiffle had come from and realizing how many songs the Quarrymen performed which were country. And then they said, no, you learn skiffle, so you learn 3 or 4 chords. They know it's the same chords play country, and those same chords played rock and roll. And so it all sort of starts there with them getting going in 56. And that's why skiffle died out. It only lasts just over 2 years. But if you don't have skiffle, you don't get any of it, which is what George said. No Lonnie Donegan, no Beatles. You've got to have that skiffle explosion in 56. And you think, at the beginning of 56, you got Rock Island Line, which starts them in skiffle groups. You got Long Tall Sally, and you got Heartbreak Hotel. Just in those first few months of 56, that's what starts the Beatles.
It's amazing when you as you talk about it, and I think about some of that music, and even growing up, hearing some of that, it makes sense. But I guess you just never think of it that way. You really don't. But it's fascinating to think about. Wanted to skip ahead a little bit in that whole creative process. I wanted to touch on one of my favorite Beatles albums, Revolver. I think during the recording that album, a lot of experimental techniques. Could you maybe shed some light on some of the different things they were doing during the recording of Revolver?
Well, they were experimenting with lots of things, including drugs, which helps to fuel a lot of Revolver. And when you think about the technology, that we can have now, it's nothing. I've got a little portable recording desk, right, which is 16 physical tracks, 250 virtual tracks, right? The Beatles are working on 4 tracks. And even by the end of it, they're only really working on 8 tracks. That is so limited. The one of the things that they'd realized was they wanted to push the boundaries, and playing live was sort of getting in the way of that. And so, as we know, not long after Revolver comes out, they stop touring altogether because they're thinking, we're never going to be able to recreate this. I think one of the great things that they did, and you start from Please Please Me and work your way through each album. They were always experimenting, but they couldn't always do the technology. They just had, because they couldn't read or write music, but they had George Martin, who could interpret what was coming out of their mouths and make an arrangement from that. But I think you also have to give a lot of credit to the engineers. People like Ken Townsend in particular, who was there, through most of their career. And he created double tracking. And that's credited to him, of one of his inventions, which just expands what you can do with a voice. So they're still limited on tracks. So they had to know that once they lay down the backing bits, so you got obviously drums, bass, and rhythm guitar. That only leaves you 1 track to record anything else. So they do this thing called bouncing. So you then take those 3 basic tracks you've done and you mix those down onto one track. And once you've done that, you cannot go back, because then you use those 3 tracks you've already recorded on and you tape over them. So this would go on, in which case sometimes you could be going maybe 5, 6 times of bouncing down and mixing down. So you're mixing the song as you go. And once you've done that mix down, you can't go back. So that's why they would often do so many different takes, because they had to get it exactly right. Because once it was done, it was committed to a track and that's it. You had to work on that. So that process, because they're now trying to create more and more different sounds and do overdubs and have lots of vocals and different instruments on there, that's taking longer and longer. And when you think back to Please Please Me, when they finished that album in one night, you're now taking weeks to do an album. And their problem was, because they were still touring, finding slots to go into the studio, work on some songs, and then go back on tour and then come back. It wasn't satisfactory. But because of their work ethic, which a lot of people don't give me enough credit for, I think, they were working so hard and they were perfectionists. And once they had this idea of, I want this to sound like this, somehow they had to work out in the studio how to do that. And that's where, obviously, we've had the sitar starting to come into the tracks. So there's already a different feel. And we've had a bit of that in Rubber Soul. So they were getting more and more creative and not satisfied with just, okay, this worked last time, let's just do the same thing. No 2 albums are the same. So I think with the technology, and of course, because by now they've all got their own big houses and they've all got their own studios at home as well. So as well as what they're doing in the studio, they're going home and experimenting and then coming in and saying, right, I've done this. So they don't have to then add in what they've done at home into a mix. And I can't remember who says it now, but they're describing, because they want to, putting tape loops and things in. And the only way you could do it, because it was physical tape, was you'd get a pencil, stick it in, and then pull it out to whatever time you wanted. And they would sometimes be going outside of the actual mixing room where the control desk was, because they wanted the loop to go on for so long. So these things that nowadays is so easy with digital. Back then it wasn't. So that they were just like pushing and pushing and thinking, how can we make this different? How can we make it? And I think that one thing with Revolver, and I've talked to a friend of mine who, because obviously I'm too young, I wasn't there in the 60s when the Beatles were happening, and said, and when he first got Revolver, he didn't like it. No, he'd seen the Beatles in 63. He was getting the albums, but he didn't like Revolver at first. So he put it away and started following the Monkees, and then came back to Revolver and got into it, and then started appreciating it. And that's what I think is becoming more and more a thing for them, was because they were musically pushing the boundaries so much, and Revolver was definitely doing that. It wasn't always, yes, I've got it on first listen. There's a number of fans who've said they've had to play it a few times over, and then they start realizing what's going on. I'm thinking, wow, this is absolute genius. So, and that's what I love about that creative process. And there's 2 brilliant books by a friend of mine, Ken Womack, who's done the biography of George Martin. And just listening and reading what was going on in the studio at the time gives you such an appreciation of the whole team that was around the Beatles, and just enabling them to do basically whatever they wanted to do. And nobody had done it before. And I think that's the thing we always have to appreciate, particularly now to looking back in history, is they were the first to be doing all of these things and showing other groups, this is what you can do. And what an album. Revolver is fabulous.
So great segue. You mentioned, you mentioned about the country influence, and now you just mentioned during that segment there about George Martin. I was interested in your thoughts on, so you have that blend of country, but now you have George Martin and you have his whole classical background. So how does that now start to further influence a lot of their songs and their techniques as they grow?
Well, I don't think it was ever a case of George Martin coming to them and saying, I want to introduce a string quartet. It was always the other way around. And that's what, again, he needs so much credit for. They'd come in, and normally it'd be Paul or John, and they'd come in and say, I've got this sound in my head. I want it to sound like this. One of John's famous one was, is it For Tomorrow Never Knows, I think. I want this to sound like the Dalai Lama and 10,000 monks chanting on the top of the Himalayas. That's what I want to sound like. And they even talked about, at one point, John being suspended from the ceiling of Studio 2 so they get the microphone things. So they were coming and saying, I want to do this. And George and the engineers would have to come up with something. But I think they trusted George Martin so much when they said, right, this is what I think I need to be hearing. Can you create something for it? And that's where the partnership worked so well, because George Martin could then just go and write a score and they'd be happy with it, because by that point, they'd been working together for 4 years. They understood each other. And George Martin was never a producer who just imposed everything on them. In the early days especially, he was giving them a lot of tips and a lot of guidance because they didn't know what to do. By the time we're getting to 66, it's just a conversation, almost among friends, because they got to know each other so well and trusted each other. And George Martin could just go away and he knew exactly the sound that they were wanting.
Fantastic. I still get amazed listening to someone like you, David, who talks about that. I just, obviously not growing up back in the 60s, but being able to listen to the albums as my mom would play them. And I think I still hear things even now that I don't think I heard before. And I upgraded my collection. I went back and I got all the albums on 180 grade vinyl. And I feel like I hear things still to this day that I'm like, I can't believe they were coming up with it back then. It's fantastic. So I want to talk a little bit about some of their evolution. And you started to mention about some of the instruments like the sitar. You mentioned the Dalai Lama. I wanted to ask you about their retreat to Rishikesh. How do you think that impacted them and their own personal relationships, and then in turn the musical direction?
It's funny, not long ago I was talking to Paul Saltzman, who famously was in Rishikesh at the same time as the Beatles, and he became really good friends with them, took those amazing photos, and he was just telling me, what it was like. And it's weird. One of the analogies for me was, once I realized, because all they had access to were their guitars, nothing else, no technology. They get cleaned up So the drugs are gone. The media's gone. You've just got guitars, and it made me think this is almost like John and Paul back in their teens in Paul's house when they're first writing songs. You know, this time they're out in Rishikesh is their most creative. And there's at least 30 songs written in those few months that they're out there. And it's almost like, right, the drugs, Beatlemania, everything's gone. All the technology's gone. All we've got are these guitars. And I think they rediscovered a love for just noodling around on a guitar. And obviously Donovan was out there and he gave them a few new techniques and stuff. And their songwriting changed. And they came up with so many songs. And obviously we end up with, you know, the White Album, which is the most eclectic album ever, just for any genre you can think of, is on there in some form or another. I think for them, it was the most creative period since before they became a recording band, because there's no restrictions on them. They've got this time as friends again, which I think also helped them. And, you know, because obviously they're not touring anymore. They've got none of that pressure. And I think they just found such a sense of peace. What else was there to do? If you're that creative as, you know, the geniuses we know they were, you've suddenly got all this time, not having to fit in, you know, going on tour, then nipped into the studio, then there's a film to make, and we've got this deadline. All of that was gone. And they just were free to create. And it is their most productive time. And they come up with so many different songs. And it's just, I think for them, it's one of those weird things. It's almost like being able to take a sabbatical. That's what they were doing. They were saying, right, we've done this solid now for 5 years. We need a break. And they got their break, and it helped recharge the batteries, definitely. But the creativity was phenomenal, really was.
So you said something there that I thought was interesting about just, you know, friends appreciating each other. Curious about, how did you feel about because at least we hear about it, some tension existing between John and Paul, maybe more in the later years. I'll say professional tension. How do you think that really influenced the dynamic of not just between John and Paul, but the rest of the group? How do you think that influenced them, David?
I think you can see there's a gradual drifting apart. They've gone from this wonderful time out in India. Then by the time you get to the end of 68 and you get into 69, and obviously we've seen the Get Back series, everything in their life has changed. And you think about it, obviously Brian Epstein's not around, and that changed the dynamic. Somebody's got to keep pushing the band, and Paul takes on that lead. George has convinced him to go to Rishikesh. Fair enough. Paul got him to push through with Magical Mystery Tour to mixed success. He then comes up with the Let It Be idea of filming them. And I can see it's a good idea. But of course, by then, you know, they're all married, getting domesticated. They've had all this unbelievable success. They've got no financial worries. They're off doing other little projects of their own as well. So it's almost that there's a partial split. But it's good because it keeps them, in a way, being apart keeps them together, because they get a chance to go off and do their own little bits. But by the time you're getting 69, you know, getting through the Let It Be project, ends up with the Get Back film and Abbey Road, the whole writing songs together, that had sort of ended way before that probably around once by 65. You're saying most of the songwriting is either John or Paul, and the other would maybe finish off a little bit. By the time you're in 69, you would rarely get them all in the studio at the same time. Particularly for someone like Abbey Road, the last one they recorded, it was very rare for them all to be together. Tensions were that bad, and they were getting pulled apart because of Apple. What a great idea it was, but with nobody with a good business brain left to be in charge to run it. You see John falling for Alan Klein's wonderful words of, I can do this, I can do that. John convinces Ringo and George. And of course, Paul wants his father-in-law, Lee Eastman. And of course, the irony is Lee Eastman and the Eastman family were experienced in that realm of entertainment and would have been ideal. But because they were pulling apart, it was almost getting down to John saying, all right, you want that, Paul, but this is still my group. But actually, I don't particularly care about this group, but it's still my group. And when they have that horrible meeting where John announces that he's quitting at the end of 69, and they agree to keep it quiet, you got 3-1. So as well as John and Paul not writing songs together anymore, you've got a standoff, and you can see that in the Get Back series. And I think there's been some careful editing in there because there was a lot more tensions going on. Yes, it was awkward having Yoko in the studio, but you can still see every now and again there was still some fun there, because we talk about country music. Every now and again, John and Paul would just go back into one of their skiffle songs, which was quite often a country song, and they jam and have some fun. But you can see that George as well, the dynamic there is wrong. And George obviously gets up, walks out and see you around the clubs. And you could see at that point, Paul thinks the dream was over. Now they convinced George to come back. But by then, I think you've gone, and I think the way they describe it is always right, is that they were brothers. And when you grow up with brothers and sisters in a family, at some point, there's going to be a fallout. I'm one of 4, so it's 2 lads, 2 girls. And as you grow up and you're off doing different things, you do drift, and then you come back together. And it doesn't even have to be anything massive like with the Beatles, where there was huge problems. But that's just what families do. You go off and you start your own families and you have your own little lives. Their problem was they tried to go off and do their own thing, but they always had to keep coming back. And it got to the stage where the sibling rivalry got too much. Paul's trying to keep them together, but in the role that he's taken on to try and keep them together is actually what's helped them to drift apart. He's trying to be the manager because somebody's got to be, and that's never going to be John. John's happy to be leader, but not responsible manager. And so you've got that tension, and that's just becoming too much, and they need a break. And instead of saying, okay, going to Rishikesh was great, we took a nice break there, let's do that again, they try and push on and do the next project. Billy Preston comes in and saves the day. And I love that bit when they moved back to Savile Row. Billy Preston's come in, and they're genuinely saying, should we make him a member of the group? He could be the 5th Beatle. Because he helped ease that tension there. But it was clear, even though Abbey Road is an absolute work of genius, it wasn't really a collaborative album as such, because they're all dipping in and out of the studio doing their own bits. And John and Paul hardly speaking to each other by this time, and it's so sad. But yet, amongst all that, they can create an album like Abbey Road, which is phenomenal. So yeah, it was sad to watch, but it helped you understand, in the Get Back, how it happened and why it happened.
As you were saying that, at least in my mind, I'm somewhat afraid to ask this question because I have an answer in my mind that I want this to be, but we're going to find out. So, knowing of the tension, you talk about it, John and Paul, even George. Obviously, John, unfortunately, tragically, what happened with him. As at that point, at least for John, are they friends at that point still? John, Paul, George, Ringo?
Oh yeah. It'd all been sorted by then, and I think the peacemaker was always Ringo. He was so good at doing that. And Ringo tells the story of saying, when tensions were running high, and he'd go around and see John, and he'd say, oh, things aren't good. Is it me? He said, no, it's not you. Is it you? No, it's not me. Oh, I thought it was me. Oh, it isn't. Oh, okay. So then you go, and he had the same conversation with George and Paul and think, well, it's not me. Or maybe it's not there anyway. But they had this sibling thing. But as we know, Ringo was good at getting each of them to help him on his solo stuff. But do you know, I spoke to May Pang many years ago, and at the time she was with John in New York, was the first time that he and George had seen each other. And George and Patty come in, and she said, first thing she said to us, look, the girls stand back. This is family. Don't get involved in it. And George was right in John's face and shouting, where were you when I needed you? And stuff. And John says, I'm sorry, but I'm here now. And they fixed their relationship there and then. But Paul then catches up with John in New York. And then they would keep in touch regularly. And of course, there's the famous story where they're sat in John's apartment, and on the American TV show, they're saying, okay, here to check. If you come down now and just play a song, I will give you this amount of money. And John and Paul seriously thought about doing it. And in the end, they said, nah, we'll leave it. But yeah, thankfully, they had all reconciled with each other. They'd all been through their own, whether professional or unofficial therapy, they got through it and started realizing what they had was fantastic. And just as often happens in families, they healed their relationships. And that's one thing Paul has always said, that after John had died, he said, I was just so glad that we'd made up. He said, because, we loved each other. We'd done all this wonderful stuff together. He said, if I hadn't have done that, I don't know how I would have lived with myself. And thankfully, they'd all grown up. They got their families. They were doing their own things and realizing, do you know what? Actually, that was good fun. What a journey we were on. We can still be friends. And yeah, that was all healed. So that was fabulous.
Yeah, I've always wanted to think that, and I thought that was true, and I know today I want to ask, and I was a little bit nervous about that because I think all of us, if that wasn't true, David, I think we would have all felt sad.
Yeah, definitely.
So interesting. You brought up when you said about healing back, 60s, 70s, and even to now, right? I still don't think it's a huge enough topic when we think about mental health and our journeys. Curious, when I hear and listen to the Beatles, some of their songs, Yesterday, Help, like, do you think that was intentional? Were they experiencing their own, mental health journeys? Were they looking to try to write these songs to help themselves or to help others?
The most important one you mentioned there is help. Um, when I was working on the Looking for Lennon documentary film, one of the things that I was keen for was at the end of the film was to have help performed as John intended it. Now on YouTube, there's a clip of the demo of Help, but John has often spoken about that song. And it's one of those strange things when you watch the official video, you've got John singing with this big smile on his face. Help me if you can, I'm feeling down. And John was saying by 1965, he said this was a genuine cry for help. He said it was almost because of all the tragedies, taken from his mum at 5, lost his Uncle George when he was 14, lose his mum at 17, Stuart Sutcliffe, age 21. He said we weren't allowed to talk about it. He didn't cry, so you buried it. He said by 1965, I was numb. John had all the money he could want, all the girls, all the success, you name it. But he had no contentment. And his way of expressing his feelings was in lyrics. And if you strip out, like the echo of the line that Paul and George were doing, when I was younger, so much younger than today, I never needed anybody's help in any way. Carefree. But now those days have gone. I'm not so self-assured. Help me if you can, I'm feeling down. I mean, how more open does it need to be? I am in pain. I need help. I'm even calling the song Help. But because the film then becomes called Help, and it's got to be a title track, instead of it being almost like a bluesy ballad cry for help that John was writing, it becomes this pop song with more grin and a smile in the way about how much help that he needs. And that was a huge, huge problem. I mean, it's typical of growing up I suppose anywhere, but, in British society, and particularly with John's upbringing, where Mimi would never cry, would never talk about feelings. Everything has to be suppressed. And because of that, it's no surprise that when he eventually gets help with the primal scream therapy, it causes so much pain. Because he's got to go all the way back to being 5 years old, of having to choose between his parents. And if you think about John's life, and that's one of the things we were trying to portray in the film, if one of these things happens to you, I won't say a simple thing, but a more commonplace thing, where parents split up and a child's divided with time between parents, that can have a massive effect for the rest of your life. Just that one thing. But here we've got a 5-year-old lad who has to choose between his mum and his dad and doesn't get to live with either of them. He's living with his auntie and uncle, doesn't see his dad again for donkey's years because it was considered not good for him. Hardly sees his mum because it was considered not too good for him. So all these people were making these decisions for John's life. And there's him who needs the help. And I think it's one of those things, as you say, nowadays we're so much more aware of mental health and its issues and PTSD and all these kind of things, which are now openly talked about. Back then it was all suppressed. And I don't think enough people talk about what Paul had to go through with losing his mum. In a way, it's always sort of overshadowed by John. But Paul, age 14, loses his mum. And from the way Mike, his brother's always described it, Paul just retreats into himself for months. He doesn't really communicate. He's just been awkward. He's losing himself in his music. His guitar was his therapy. But he was burying all of that. And obviously, that's come out in songs like Let It Be. But Paul's gone through that trauma and he's suffered and he puts his own mask on. And I think that the two of them, they understood each other because they've both been through it. But John was more able to talk about that because that's how he wrote and how he spoke. Paul didn't. And so I think sometimes we don't give Paul enough credit for how he coped with losing his mum and what he did. Because that must have been horrendous for him. And then having committed it to song into it like Let It Be, and that song is still played decades afterwards, that's a constant reminder of the fact that he lost his mum when he was 14, which is something you cannot get over. So that I think it's a really good aspect is the mental health of these guys, particularly when you think about what it was like for them on tour. They saw the inside of an aeroplane, inside of a limo, inside of a hotel, inside of a venue, and we're getting screamed at and whatever. The only people to have toured the world and seen nowhere. Now, can you imagine that life where you got no freedom? Yeah, so that is bound to have an effect on you as well. So it's it's a big topic in a way, the mental health of the Beatles.
Listen, I know you're a busy man and I don't want to give you more work, but as you started to explain that, I think that would make a fantastic book story, just focusing on their mental health and how they coped. And that line you just said was so poignant, having toured the world, but saw nowhere. I can see it already. That's the title. So moving forward, I couldn't let this go without asking your opinion. Obviously, some of their songs, a lot of their songs, most of their songs still stand to today. They're relevant, right?
Yeah.
How do you feel about the newest song that's been released? And the use of AI, good or bad?
I think historically it's very important because we know it's the last song that will ever have all four of them on. So from that point of view, very important. It's not a bad song, but it was never going to be a chart topping thing for the quality of the song because it was a throwaway demo that was never developed. But I think what they've been able to do with it, and it depends what you understand with AI, because the voices haven't been AI'd. I mean, there's so much stuff I get links all the time for YouTube. Oh, this is such and such a song, as if it had been sung by John or whatever. I'm not interested in that kind of stuff. But I think that the technology that Peter Jackson's team have developed, when you listen to the demo of the song, then you just hear the fact they've been able to isolate John's vocal, take all the rest of that, clean it up. So the others, when you think of what they did with Free as a Bird, look at the difference in the quality, because that was, here's John singing with a waste paper basket over his head in a toilet cubicle, echoey, and then the others come in. This was constant all the way through. This could have been recorded by all four of them at the time. So I think that was genius. I think some of the arrangement is a bit over the top. I think that particularly with the strings, the orchestral sound on it, knowing what Paul thought about Let It Be when he got Phil Spectored, and we got Let It Be naked. I was surprised at how much orchestration there was on it. So I would have liked it to be a lot simpler. And it's funny with technology, there are so many versions on YouTube where other people have AI'd it and done their own arrangement. There's a great one which is as if it had been done in 64 for Hard Day's Night. Really sounds good. So I think the arrangement was a bit disappointing. And there's so many stories connected to it, whether they're mythical or not. Were John's last words to Paul, "Think about me every now and then, my friend." If so, then that is extra special. So I liked it. And I think they did a really good job of it. It is a good song. And in a way, it was a nice way to sign off of the last song with all four of them on. So I think that's what it'd be remembered for.
Again, great segue. I wanted to end with this. We talked a little bit about John, life tragically cut short. So when you mentioned that, his last words to Paul. So David, your thoughts on this? In that next life, I'll say across the universe, John and Paul meet again. What do you think their first conversation would be about?
Oh, what a question. I just think that they would be like brothers catching up. If you got a member of the family who's moved overseas and you haven't seen him for a while. No, one of my best mates growing up, he emigrated to Nova Scotia back in, when was that, 1986. And we keep in touch. But obviously there's huge gaps between us physically seeing each other. And it's one of those wonderful things where, it could be 4 or 5 years since we've physically been in the same place together. And yeah, we sort of, obviously we keep in touch with technology and stuff. But it's almost like the last time I saw him was yesterday, that you're straight back into just talking about what you're doing in your life, how the family is, what you've been up to. And I can just imagine, again, it's like I was saying before with the Rishikesh thing. I think that, in a way, would be what it would be like. Going through this lovely, tranquil place, and there'd be a couple of guitars just hanging around, and it's like, and they'd just go and start jamming, and they'd have a real good laugh and a catch up, as if it had only been, to pardon the pun with Paul, of yesterday, since they last saw each other, and they'd just get straight back into it.
I love that answer. And I didn't realize, but I almost, thinking about that scene in my head as you were describing it, I think I felt myself starting to well up. I'm not even going to try to say I'm cutting onions because it's too early for that where I'm at. But no, David, thank you so much. I appreciate that. Well, listen, doing so much great stuff. You just, for me, lights up the room when we talk.
Oh, thank you.
And I just hope, I think obviously they don't need our help, but just everything they're about, the music, all of it needs to continue to stay relevant and stay alive. And I think you're doing a fantastic job with that. So again, thank you, David. Anything you got coming out in the near future you wanted to give a shout out, plug here?
I'm working on a documentary on the Beatles in Hamburg at the moment. So we've been working on that on and off for 18 months, but intensely for about the last 8 months. So we've got down to like a 52-minute cut that we're looking at the moment, and we're just sort of tweaking with that. But Hamburg's never been done properly, and it's such an important place in the story of the Beatles. And it's been great, going over to Hamburg and meeting some of the people who were there back then. And I've learned so much of how important it was. And so that is going to be really exciting when that comes out. So hopefully that will be maybe summertime this year, but that's a really, really good project, because if you don't have Hamburg, you don't have the Beatles. So
Awesome.
it's fun.
I'll be looking forward to that. And listen, I'll definitely be staying in touch with you, following you on your YouTube, your books, everything. Like I said, I'm a fan, and this is greatly appreciated. So, well, thanks everyone for listening. I hope you enjoyed this as much as I did. David, thanks again. Take care.
Pleasure. See you next time.
Oh, there will be a next time. Thanks, David.
Good man.
This has been the Bare Essentials. Thanks for listening, and remember, never hibernate on your goals.